Awesome. So this will be available for everyone who registered. So if you can't take copious notes, don't worry. You'll have it for prosperity's sake. So for those that have signed up, you've already heard kind of this story of Sherri and I. As most of you know, I came from the middle of nowhere, Iowa, in 1994, and I came here as a nanny. Was my first job on Cape Cod, and I knew no one, and except for a 9-year-old who was a very precocious 9-year-old that I was taking care of. And so I volunteered to do costumes at a children's theater in Harwich called the Harwich Junior Theater, if anyone is familiar with it. And Sherri was working there for the summer doing like PR and marketing, right?
Yep, and the business manager, yeah.
And so she was friend number 1 in Massachusetts. And I still, when refer to her, is my original friend Sherri, because that is the role that she plays. So before we get started, and I know that's not why you're here, but I just have to show you this picture of the two of us from, we were just saying, from 1995. So there we are. This is in my apartment in Jamaica Plain. I had a Halloween party, and it was Sherri dressed as a nun. And for those who have read Sherri's bio and so forth, she works within a Jewish high school. She is Jewish, and so this was her big shtick, like, and I was the devil, but it was just perfect that we were like, good versus evil. This is my friend Dawn, and I don't know who this is. Well, I don't even know how they fit back there.
Or why he's photobombing us.
I think it's like a ghost. Anyway, so we were also noting that we have aged very well in our minds. So we just want, like, that could have been yesterday, except I had red hair, which was a natural shade of raspberry.
And my hair might have been naturally this color, but it was still this color.
So you've all received, you have my bio, you have Sherri's bio, you know kind of where we're coming at from this point. Because she's my original friend, Sherri, I knew that I was going to have this conversation at some point with her because I am overwhelmed by this concept. And also, I follow her on Facebook, and she has the best, every third day, a best like kids admission parent quip that, some strange thing that happened, and they always make me laugh. And so I realized that I soon will be the people that she is writing about. So, so instead of just her and I sitting down and having this conversation, I knew that all of my friends are kind of in this same place, right? Like, double hands up for those that are like, oh my God, I can't believe that we were just saying like 1995 seems like 20 years ago. And I also think that 2005, when I became a mom, was like yesterday. And that just gives me goosebumps. Like the fact that he had his first driving lesson with the auto school today just is too much, right? And so thus, I work with moms that are in this empty nest phase. And I knew that this is a topic that isn't kind of the thing that we normally do, but all of my people are having the same things. So while we get started, now I want you to put into the chat, if you could just get one question answered tonight, what would it be? So that way I can keep referencing back to it and so forth. I have a book worth of questions here. So, so Sherri, you have come from, you worked at Brandeis, like back in the day when we were still hitting Lansdowne Street, and now you transitioned from the high school side, from the college side to the high school side. Why did you make that transition, and kind of what is the biggest difference? Like, how is it that you probably approach your job now coming from that other side?
Sure, thanks. So hi, everybody. Thanks, Jennessa, for hosting me. This is fun. It's what I do all day, but it's still fun. So a lot of admissions counselors actually get their start as as tour guides, or being involved in admissions office as an undergraduate. And that was the same for me. I went to Brandeis University, and then after Brandeis, I went to grad school, and then I interned for the Boston Celtics for a season. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to do for a job, when I had been a senior at Brandeis, I was an intern in the admissions office, and I loved it. I said, okay, how do I get to do this? So I got my master's degree in public relations, but so much of college admissions is about PR and marketing a school, but then you learn about how to read applications and make decisions and work with families and things like that. So I ended up working at Brandeis for 11 years. And then I shifted. I left in the middle of some political drama, and I worked at Northeastern University for a year and had a chance to learn, instead of about a school that admitted all students to one program, all liberal arts students, I worked at a school that had some different criteria, whether a student was a business major or an engineering student or an architecture student. So I got a really different perspective. It also, talk about dating oneself, it was 2005, and reading applications online was really very brand new. We didn't have like big folders. We used to read everything that was like in a big, thick folder. So I learned at Northeastern, though, they were a very early adopter of online reading, and I had a chance to learn how that worked. I was there in a relatively short-term position, and I knew it would be, because I said I left during some political drama and was able to land this like special opportunity, but I thought maybe I'd stay at Northeastern or look for my next job as a director of admissions somewhere. And then I got a call one day from someone I knew at Dana Hall School in Wellesley, which is an all-girls international boarding and day school. And she said, have you thought about switching to the high school side? And actually at first I said, no, but I liked her. And she said, well, come talk to me. And I thought working in a high school would give me really good perspective for going then back to college admissions after some period of time. And the longer I worked in a high school, the more things I saw that I liked about the high school side. And then ended up a few years later shifting over to work at Gann Academy, which is a Jewish day school in Waltham, grades 9 through 12, co-ed. We have a little over 300 students. And so that's my perspective, is working both in two private schools, but two very different schools and communities, and also two private colleges, but very different colleges. So there are a lot of things that are very, very similar. Part of why a lot of high schools like to hire people that worked in admissions is they figure we know the admission process from the inside and we have that perspective. But a huge difference is the amount of time we spend with kids, and I would say our emotional investment in our students. On the college side, a big piece of your job is to decide if a student should be admitted or not, but then you're sort of done with that student. Either they don't get in, or they do get in, but then you hand them off to the orientation office and to academic affairs, and their lives continue. When you work in a high school, you start the journey with the student at whatever point, and you're with them the whole way through all the emotions and all of the different parts of the application process and decision-making process, right through graduation, and then sometimes be able to continue beyond that. So I was wooed to the high school side and thought I'd just stay for a little while, and here I am 16 years later. I will admit that a piece of what keeps me in high schools is having a much more flexible summer and schedule than I used to have in admissions, but it's really about the kids and having a really different kind of job.
Awesome. And just as a sidebar, Sherri did an internship with the Celtics in what year?
1993.
And
29 years later, I'll do the math for you.
Yes, thank you. She is still on, it's not an internship anymore, but what is it that, how do you say what you do?
I call it, I know this is being recorded, I call this my not so secret life. It's sort of my secret life that I keep stats and help create a box score with a team at the games. But I call it my not so secret life because I just kind of do it separate from my regular job, but I'm on ESPN quite a bit. So now if you're a Celtics fan, and if we have a game on Sunday, you might see me sitting at the scores table in a headset. So we'll see.
Which is very cool to be able to say, oh, look, there's my original friend Sherri on TV. So, okay, so let's get started kind of big and get down. So let's just talk about, most of the women that are on here have a high schooler or a family member who's a high schooler how do we even, when I went to school in high school, back in 1908 at this seemingly at this time.
In
We did
Iowa.
activities in Iowa. We did activities because we enjoyed the said activities. We took classes because they were of interest and so forth. I will say that I knew I was going on an art track, so I didn't take physics. I didn't take advanced chemistry. I didn't take advanced math and so forth. But for the most part, everyone kind of did the same thing. We also didn't have as many choices as they have now. There was never a discussion, oh, you need to do this because it'll look good on a college application. And I feel like, and I don't know if this is just from the community that I live in, that is so much part of the conversation. What is your thought on choosing activities and so forth in high school? What should they be doing to look good?
Yeah. You know, it's a tough thing for kids that so often they do feel the pressures to do things because it looks good for college. And the reality is that there's no magic bullet or everyone would do it. If a certain activity would look good and therefore that's going to lead to some sort of outcome, then everyone would say, oh, I need to get into that activity. So I always back up and say to kids, why do you think colleges even care about what activities you're involved in and what you're doing with your free time? And the answer is that they're building their communities. They want a community. The phrase used to be that they wanted well-rounded students. We now hear more about wanting a well-rounded class. They want students that are going to have things to talk about and things to be excited about and things to bring to the table in their college communities. So it's not about the quantity, it's not about the diversity, and it's definitely not about certain activities. It's really about when you have some free time, how are you spending it? And so if students were honest and said, I spend all my free time watching Netflix and playing video games, those kids are probably perfectly still admissible to college. But that becomes a little bit less attractive because the college is like, well, we're not looking for a community of kids who are then going to sit in their dorm rooms and not be a part of our activities and of our, campus lives. Are looking for students to do other kinds of things. So I usually recommend that if a student, to start where you started, Jennessa, with your own feeling, if a student wants to do an activity, yes, they should do it. If then that might lead to a leadership opportunity, that's great. But to force the issue so then you have a student doing an activity or sticking with a sport or whatever it is, and they're not enjoying it, chances are other aspects of their life are going to suffer. And then that really doesn't all work out in the end. It's also not the case of, oh, good, you're president of the class. You made it. That was my goal for you as a parent, was I hoped you'd be the president. There's a president of the class at every single high school in the country. And not every president of every single class at every single high school in the country is going to get into a certain group of colleges. So I think the general philosophy is one that students should do what they want to do. And if they're really not doing a lot, you might prompt them as a parent by, is there something you'd like to be involved in? Would you make a deal? Would you choose one club as a freshman, 2 clubs as a sophomore? Would you consider, if you're not loving an activity, would you do so? If you want to drop that, would you do something different? But I think pressuring kids to be in activities just because it looks good for college is only going to make them really annoy you and probably not have a different college outcome in the end.
Exactly. Perfect. So then that leads me also, again, not to call out all the tag your parents, because I actually don't think any of them are on this call, but this whole concept of AP, not AP, college prep, and so forth, like, what is the right, again, is there a formula or kind of an outlook on that?
Right. So colleges in general, every college, I told you I worked at 2 universities, but I'm familiar with many, many more. Every college is going to give some answers that are fairly standard, but then there's always nuance. And the number of times I end up saying it depends is sometimes kids look at me like, oh, she just said it depends again. And it really does. There are 3,000 or more 4-year colleges in this country, and they're all going to have a bit of a nuanced answer. To me, it's not necessarily about counting up how many APs, how many honors, how many of this, and that, but it is about students being in an appropriate level of challenge where they can also be successful. So if taking 3 APs junior year is the right level of challenge and the student can be successful, then that's a good move. if taking even one AP would be completely overwhelming, but the student can be really successful, whether defined by grades, but also defined by being able to sleep at night and manage their homework and be involved in some of those activities and other things and have their friendships, then they shouldn't be taking APs. There are some colleges that will say we want to see rigor, rigor, rigor. And sometimes, I wish it weren't, but sometimes that can be defined by AP and advanced or honors classes. Some students will say we want to see a high GPA, like how schools are going to work is going to differ. But most schools that are not the ones that are always in the news for how hard it is to get into, the majority of colleges want to see students who get reasonable grades. And then when they get recommendations and things, they see that the kids are doing their work and participating in class. But if you have a high achieving student, they should be in classes that are going to challenge them over the idea of, oh, well, if I take easier classes, I'll get all A's. The college is going to say, well, I see all A's. Why weren't you doing more? Which leads frequently to the question of, is it better to get a B in a harder class or an A in an easier class? I get that all the time. The reality is that the most selective colleges in the country want you to get the A in that highest level class. And there are students who will do that. I sometimes call them the and kids. They took all those classes and they got all A's and they're the lead in the play and they can do back somersaults, you know, in the gymnastics festival and. But most students, sorry, my screen, most students though, should look at, again, that feeling of how can I feel academically successful and not worry so much about, is it the harder class versus the A, but what is the right level of rigor and the right level of engagement to be able to manage their homework and enjoy going to their classes every day. And if taking honors physics is going to make a student miserable, I'd rather they took a different class. But if taking honors physics is a specific requirement for if they want to be an engineering major, then that might be a good idea, even if they're not going to love it. So maybe somewhere else they add in an elective and have a little bit of say in their schedule.
Excellent. Well, as it relates to the high school portion of this and where we're at right now, I know for us, Zanes High School is 1,700 kids. There aren't a bajillion of you. Like, your kind of student to counselor ratio is probably much lighter than what we have. So it's this feeling of like, should we be hiring an outside person to help us navigate this process?
So believe it or not, even at my school with our very small ratio, sometimes families choose to do that. That said, and sometimes people are paying for me and then we'll hire someone else and then I'll have a friend call me, say, can I hire you? And like, it's this vicious, crazy cycle, but I don't do too much of that, if any, because I have a full-time job and another job that you already heard about, but I digress. So the college application process is actually not difficult, believe it or not. Students are asked to do things that they could all do. Even someone wrote that they have 14-year-olds. They could do it now. The application process involves filling out some general information like your name and address and where you go to school. What activities have you been involved in? You write an essay of 500 to 600 words, which even some 14-year-olds have written. It's only like a page and a half. And then some colleges have some individual questions. You then ask for recommendations, and like there's other pieces that maybe you take SATs, maybe not. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. Like there are other supplemental things. The application process itself is really not that difficult. And most students in most high schools have some adult in the school that would be willing to, for free, proofread an essay, look over their activities, talk them through what they're thinking about. Most students at most high schools also have resources through their school counseling office or guidance office or whatever it's called to help them learn about various colleges and help them kind of get going on the right track. So if all of that you're nodding and you're saying, yeah, this is us, we can do this, that's really how the process is designed. And hiring an independent consultant is probably not necessary. You know, being able to even hire an independent consultant is really coming from a place of privilege because they tend to be fairly expensive. So I think a lot of people hire independent consultants more out of nerves and fear than out of actual need. They certainly can do a helpful job and they can really help manage the process. And hopefully they know a lot about what they're talking about, like in any profession, some are better than others. But I really think that if you as a parent have a time to work with your kid and you follow the resources of the school, then it's often fine. I've had people say to me, well, the school doesn't know anything. And I said, well, why don't you just go to the information night and see? And they come back and they say, oh, wow. Now that I have this resource book to just follow along, they gave me a step-by-step guide, we can do this. That's certainly not the case in every high school, but I think often there's this rumor, especially in, I'll say wealthier communities, that, oh, you have to have this outside person and you have to. And the reality is that if that's right for your family, you could, but it's unlikely it's as necessary. There's so much free information online. And yes, I know that can get overwhelming also, but most high schools are going to have some resources that when students are juniors, they're going to share with you to start to get the process moving along.
And I know within our community, we have like a guidance email that comes out weekly that is overwhelming. And many times I just am like, I can't even, like there's a lot of information that comes there. So, all right, staying in high school, testing, not testing, SATs, ACTs, I don't know, Iowa basic skills. What is the going concept?
Okay, so let me say a word, especially for some of you with younger kids, or there was a comment about someone who didn't go to high school in this country. Let me just give a short word or two on framing about this. The SAT and ACT are two different tests, but colleges look at them equally and interchangeably. When Jennessa and I applied to high school, Jennessa, I'm going to guess you took the ACT if you were from Iowa. Yep. And it used to be that most kids on the coast took the SAT, which is run and owned by the College Board. And most kids from the Midwest or most of the middle of the country took the ACT. Over time, that has changed and they're really now completely interchangeable. And there is no college anymore that only accepts one or the other or has a preference for one or the other. So I'll tell you in a second about the differences, but I wanted you to know that part first. I never recommend taking SATs or ACTs before the spring of junior year of high school. Sometimes students will say, or parents will say, well, I want my kid to just try and be exposed to it and whatever. I think for a practice test, that might be okay, but usually the scores are not great because it's normed for junior year or senior year of high school. And all that happens is that the students feel really deflated because they didn't get a great score. But the reality is if they had done a little bit more school and continued to work on their skill building, they would have done better later, even without test prep or anything else like that. So the SAT now has two sections. It has a section called EBRW, evidence-based reading and writing. It's the closest to what many of us used to call the verbal section, but now the EBRW and the math. The ACT has four sections. It has an English section that's similar to this EBRW, a reading section that is social science-y, mostly reading comprehension passages, a science section, and a math section. So some students like that in the EBRW, it can be any kind of question, and whatever it is, they do it and they move along. In the ACT, you know that when you're in the reading section, the questions are going to be about social science. And when you're in the science section, they're going to be about science. So sometimes students like sort of the compartmentalization of the ACT. There are a lot of guides, without taking the time right now, that if you Googled differences between the SAT and ACT, the timing's a little bit different. The number of questions is different. There's some nuanced differences, but that's kind of the gist of it. One of the tests, you have to fit in more questions into a time period, but therefore the design of the questions leads you to working a little bit faster. The other, you can take a little bit more moment to breathe, but the questions might be differently challenging. So some students do a little bit better on one or the other based on how their brain works, about this compartmentalization and speed and things like that. But college-wise, they're equal. They're scored very differently. The SAT goes from 200 per section to 800 per section, so it goes up to 1,600. The ACT, the highest score is a 36. The lowest is about a 12. I don't remember. We never see the lowest number. So it's a different scoring system, but again, they're interchangeable, and you can also easily find charts online of how one equates to another. So for at least 30 years, there have been some colleges that were called test optional, where students could decide if they wanted to submit their test scores or not. And Bates and Bowdoin happened to be two of the earliest adopters of being test optional. And here they are in New England. So in New England, I think like this idea has been around for a long time. Over time, more schools started saying, you know, there's all kinds of research about biases related to the test, about if certain kinds of kids from certain communities succeed more, kids with certain learning styles and learning patterns succeed more. If there's all these kinds of biases, maybe we'll move away from the test and make it optional. And there were a couple of hundred schools doing that for the past 20 or more years. Like I said, started about 30 years ago, but the numbers kept growing and growing. Then in March of 2020, all of a sudden, everyone was quarantined. Every school was closed. These tests are offered in high schools, and high schools were closed and no one was allowed to be in them anyway. No one was allowed to leave their house. So almost every college in the country said, well, gee, if the students can't take these tests in the spring of junior year, maybe we'll see what will happen in the fall. Or some just said, you know, we're going to be optional for this year to take that pressure off. Those that said, we're going to see what happens in the fall, found that even if more high schools were open, we still weren't having large groups of students in rooms together taking the test. And so many high schools weren't open yet in the fall. So some colleges said we'll be test optional for 1 year, 2 year. They were doing these pilots, and others said we'll now be test optional permanently. Where we are now, year 3 in this cycle, is that still most colleges in the country are test optional, and a higher and higher number, literally weekly, says they're going to make this a permanent decision. University of Florida never went optional. But their schools all didn't close at the same rates as places others did. That was the first year. Last year, University of Georgia said we're now requiring testing. Just last week, University of Tennessee and their system said we're now requiring testing. There are also a few private schools that say, well, it's officially optional, but we really prefer it. So there's a little bit of nuance, but my crystal ball, you know, visioning is that we're going to stay in this test optional world for a while. So if you have a like 16 or 17-year-old, the tests are probably going to be optional. If you have younger students, we'll have to see how this falls out. The biggest newsmaker was when MIT about a month ago said, we're going to start requiring tests again. Everyone sort of said, well, what's going to happen at the other schools, like the Caltechs and schools similar to MIT, but also what's going to happen just to the other highly selectives. So far, for our current juniors, the other schools that would be MIT competitors haven't changed their policies, but I suspect next year a few might. But I think writ large, as we think about schools, whether public or private, large or small, whatever part of the country, most places are test optional at this point. And
So
then
if that's the case,
yeah.
so should they still take it, and then we just decide depending on what their score is?
Right.
Like
Right.
it will only help if we add
Right.
it in.
In almost all, you know, there are certainly kids, and you know, I don't know anyone on this call. I don't even really know Jennessa's kids very much, but in certain cases, there is a reason to say we're just not going to put our students through this. My recommendation usually is for students to test at least once in the spring of junior year, like between March and June, and that gives you maximum flexibility. If the test does not go so well, they don't have to send it. If the test does go well, then you can make a decision of does my child do it again to try to do even better, or are we really happy with this score? And then if the student just realizes, oh, there is this one school, and they add it back into testing policy, at least they have a baseline. Are they even closed? Should they test again in the summer or into the fall? And it gives the most flexibility. I have plenty of students who take it once, get their score, and say, no, I'm done. And then I say, well, okay, if a school pops up as these policies change, like now that we're into May, nothing changed this fall, but through the spring, if a school pops up, then the student and family will have to decide, okay, do we just say, okay, I guess the student won't apply to that school. We like it, but oh well. Or do you then over the summer look at test prep and trying to raise that score? More often, I think those families will vote no, because the students to do the test prep and everything else is kind of ridiculous where there's so many other choices. But I do think the one-time testing allows for maximum flexibility. And I don't mean testing with all kinds of test prep and all kinds of like hoops and whatever else. I mean testing to know where things are at. Your kids may go to high schools where they offer PSATs to juniors in the fall to have a good indicator. But one real SAT or ACT, I do think is helpful. And even if the only prep is doing maybe one full-length practice test at the kitchen table, timed, and then after, if you say, oh, well, this was a good score, but we think it probably could have been even higher, then maybe do some test prep more formally to try to raise it a little bit. Or we know that at this school, they say they recommend the test, even though we don't have to test, just gives that little bit more like leeway and focus on what's happening with testing and test prep.
Awesome. Okay, so now they're in high school, they have activities, we are testing, not testing. How do you help your students decide what they want to study? And I feel like that's the next right thing, right? Like, as opposed to, I decided when I was 10. We know that also didn't work out so well. One should not necessarily pick a profession at 10, because when you're 30, you're like, I'm done with this. But how do we help and guide our children in finding us an area of study?
Yeah, I think there are a few ways to go about it. I have some kids who have decided when they're 10 and they come in and they say, I want this and this and this. And we look at those kinds of schools. And even when they're only 19, they might get to the school for that major and take a few classes in the major and realize it's not right and switch. Or they might at 50 be doing the job they dreamed of when they were 10. The majority of my students don't know. And at my school, we actually don't do too much along the pick a career and pick a major path. In some families, it's more important than others. And in some high schools, I think there's more focus than others. So I'm going to talk in kind of global terms. But most colleges where most of your kids are probably going to look are going to help them with some basic skills that should be transferable to any kinds of jobs. They're going to help them be better critical readers and thinkers. They're going to help them write well. They're going to teach them to think through problems. And they're going to be able to help. They're going to help them. It's funny what I'm about to say because I stumbled. They're going to help them articulate their ideas. That just didn't come out right. So you're going to do that whether you're an engineering major or a business major or a French major, right? You're going to be working on those kinds of skills. And that's how many colleges are designed right now. There are certainly specialty colleges like Babson for business or Emerson for communications and performance or MIT for technology and engineering and things. There are specialty colleges, but most schools, and even at those schools, they're going to still teach those kinds of core skills. So often having that career pre-picked doesn't really have to happen until the students are in college, because when they're in college, they're going to be able to work with an advisor and with your career center and figure out, as they're a little bit older, what is the next step. And even at not 10, even at 18, students are, well, the parents are saying, how are you going to graduate from college and have a job, which is totally understandable. Students are thinking, oh my God, I'm not even done being a senior in high school yet. And you want me to figure out what's going to happen 4 years from now? So they're only 18. 4 years ago, right? They were really children. And if you said to a 14-year-old, where you're going to go to college, it's kind of like saying to a high school kid, what are you going to do after college? And it really overwhelms them. So all of that said, some high schools do some really good career planning. There are some really helpful career tools that I hope a lot of high schools are introducing to their kids and families. But there too, you can do some Googling, and there's a lot of free things. Help me choose a career, help me find my career strengths, things like that, that students can plug in. Here are some of my interests, and it might give them some ideas. A lot of high schools use a program called Naviance. That's kind of a database for college counseling.
How do you spell that?
N as in Nancy, AVIANCE. It's a product that high schools have to pay for, and some do and some don't. Some have. Naviance used to be sort of the program. There's now some competitors to it. But within Naviance is sort of a module that schools can offer to their students. It's called Do What You Are. And it's sort of like a Myers-Briggsy kind of, oh, I like to do these kinds of activities, yes, no, maybe, or I'd rather do this than this. And like that can lead to some, like you might enjoy these careers. At my school, we don't give Naviance access until junior year. There are some high schools that start working with it with freshmen. So that's something you can ask about if your school has it, but it might be, if you don't know about it, it's because your kids aren't old enough yet.
And when I remember having to take little assessments with my guidance counselor, and then it gave you like, these are the types of things that you need to do. And I remember there was a kid that graduated with my brother, and it said that he should be clergy. And I was like, that's really not something that, like, kind of have to have a calling there. Like, is that really a job on this? And then I remember we had big, like, catalogs, and it had all the professions and then what was the starting salary. And I at 10 decided I wanted to be an interior designer, and it was like the lowest thing. It was like $14,000. Someone's like, it doesn't matter, I so love the work, it won't matter.
And you did at the beginning.
It did, and it was actually, I still don't work for money, but I mean, motivated for, but so yeah. And I know that Zane, and he's a sophomore, has Sarah had noted that our school uses the program that you were just saying, but they have done like 16%, like 16 personality, like some of the Myers-Briggs and some of the other stuff. And there's an assessment that I use as well that also works for anyone that's 14 and older. It helps them kind of figure out like, what's the type of, like, how do they like to work? Because that's where I worked with a student a few years ago, and it came up like, motivated by money, wants to be a leader, needs to run a team, has to, all these things. And I was like, well, what are you thinking of going into? And he's like, physics. He's like, I really like physics. I'm like, but are there jobs within physics that you're driving a team and so forth? It's seemingly like more in,
right. But what can also happen is that you and I have a mutual friend, Linda. Linda was a chemistry major. I love chemistry. Okay. After college, she got a job as a chemist working in a lab, and a few years later didn't like it, but she had all this chemistry background. So she ended up going to law school and becoming a patent lawyer, where you need to have a really strong science background, and that became her career. If you would ask, certainly not 18-year-old Linda, but even 22-year-old Linda, what she wanted to do, it was science, science, science. She had a career shift, but it built completely on the fact that she now had such a strong science background, even though she wasn't doing science, so to speak, anymore. And I think that's the part that not only are high school students witnessing, they see their parents and their friends parents changing jobs. And I think some of them are like, so why do I have to decide now? And they're also seeing a world in which there's new jobs that no one ever heard of a year ago that now exist. So I think you're right in terms of figuring out skill sets and what kinds of places make you help you thrive can be really important. But sometimes picking a college based on career is, I feel like that's not as common a way now, even though it is a way for students to choose a college. But looking to see that the college has flexibility, that if a student wants to switch majors, that's doable. Or if it's harder to do, how does that work? Looking to see, do they have a career center, and at what do they provide, and at what age or level do students start working with them? Does the college have recruiters come from different companies so students can learn about different kinds of professions and things like that? Some of it may be a little bit skewed by the community I work in, but even as I go to like professional development workshops and things, I see much, much less on specific picking a major to lead to a career than I used to.
So now that leads us to this whole, which I think is the $1 million question. How, you said there's 4,000 colleges and universities within the United States. That doesn't even count if someone wants to go abroad.
Or to a 2-year college, right?
Exactly. So, and that's another piece. Like, where do you even start to figure out what's the right college for my child?
So I have a practical answer and then a little bit more parenting-y answer that I'll kind of weave together. The practical answer is just like, I remember in high school filling out a bubble sheet on a Scantron, and they ran it through a thing and they said, here's some colleges for you, right? Things like that still exist. Even if you don't have a college counselor or any other human helping you, it's no longer bubbling in with a number 2 pencil. It's now done online. But there's one that I'll put in the chat that College Board runs called Big Future. That is a search engine that you can put in. I want a school, do I want it to be small, medium, or large? And how is that defined? So small might be under 3,000, medium might be like 3 to 12, and large might be bigger than that, or whatever the number ranges are. Even within that, someone might say, oh, I still think of 4 as small, or I still think of 18 as medium, but you get the idea. Do I want to be in a city or in a suburb or in a more rural area? What region of the country or particular states do I want to be in? Is it important that there's a certain major? Is it important that there's a certain level of diversity, however that's defined, right? So you can put in these different things and a program will spit out names for you. Now, some of the names, just like the example you gave about your brother and becoming a clergy person, I could do that whole thing. Jennessa mentioned at the beginning that I'm Jewish, and it could be 14 Catholic schools. And I said, well, I don't want to go to a Catholic school, and that most of these programs don't support for. But that's part of the research that you do. So some people say, oh, we'll start with the schools we've heard of. And other people say, let's start with the schools actually that we haven't heard of. So one good starting point is to say, okay, maybe you get some sort of starting list like this, or maybe you say, you know what, even that feels overwhelming. Let's take a ride one day and look at a college. So it looked like most of you are in the greater Boston area. So let's say we're going to pick a school and you're going to go see, we'll pick the 2 I worked at, Brandeis and Northeastern. If you went to Brandeis, you'd see a school in the suburbs of 3,500 students, liberal arts programs, a very community oriented school, kids from all over the country and all over the world. And you'd get a certain feel for what a school of that size feels like. When students like Brandeis, then you think about, well, what did they like? Did they like the kind of location? Did they like the community orientedness? Did they like the size? Like, what are the things that they like? Then you say, okay, let's also take a ride to Northeastern. Northeastern, all of a sudden, we're in the downtown of a major city. We've got an enclosed campus, but still the subway, the T trolley goes through the middle of it. They've got, I don't remember their number at this point, 14,000 kids. They've got many, many, many more majors. They've got things going on in all different corners of the campus, right? It's a much busier place. They've got a co-op program that's a little bit more career oriented. It's a really, really, really different feel. If a student were to see those 2 schools, there are certainly some students that will end up applying to both, maybe because of location or a certain interest or something, about each community. But chances are students are going to have a pretty clear reaction to this was too small, this was too big, this was too busy versus this was exciting. So let's say Northeastern is, this was exciting. Okay, without taking the train to New York or flying to Washington or Miami or anywhere else, that gives you a baseline for here are some of the kinds of schools to look at, maybe in bigger cities, and realizing that, okay, if Brandeis were too small for this student, but Northeastern is a good size, that gives you some general range. So if you hear that a school is 10,000, you say, okay, that might not be too small. If you hear that it's 30,000, you can say, all right, do you think you could do double the size of Northeastern? Oh, no, that's too big. Or, oh, wow, Northeastern, I'm just getting started. Like, this feels really good. So there are schools that kind of are in peer groups and have these similarities because there's only so many criteria. So every school is going to have its own culture. Some kids want to stay close to home, some go further away. But visiting some local schools where we have 60 colleges within a 50-mile radius can be a really, really valuable starting point. That said, leads me to a little bit of like the parenting piece in all of this. Parents always want to start when their kids are 6, thinking about where they're going to go to college. Kids want to think about, what am I going to have for breakfast tomorrow? Shoot, we ran out of cereal. I guess maybe I'll have an apple, right? And I know I'm oversimplifying, but the amount of energy that parents often put into the thinking process until the student is a junior versus the amount of energy that the kids put into the thinking process about college is often very, very, very uneven. So my thinking is that, again, there's always nuance and always different needs of different families, but in general, I hardly ever recommend really starting this process until January of junior year. At my school, we do a information overview for freshmen, but we really don't start working with students and families until they're juniors. And we have this comprehensive college counseling program, but we don't think it's developmentally appropriate for kids, nor do we want to make the college search and application process take over high school. As it is, if you start in January of junior year until May of senior year, that's a year and a half of high school thinking about college. To back it up even more, you're spending your whole high school years talking and thinking and acting on what's the next step, what's the next step, what's the next step. And kids' minds really change in terms of what they want. Some kids think they really want a city, and then one day they have a bad experience in a city. And as a parent, you might say, oh, it was one bad thing, like you'll be fine. But the kid now says, I can't live in a city, I can't live in a city. Well, 6 months from now, maybe they'd like a city again. And I see things like that happening a lot. Same thing with near and far. Sometimes I talk to juniors and I call them my California dreamers. Where do you want to go to school? California, California, California. The parents are like, eek. And I say to them, don't worry, because so often that too, maybe the parents will have the opportunity to take the kid to California. Oh my God, that was a long flight. Or they don't get to travel there, but they take a plane to Atlanta to look at a school. Oh, that was a 2-hour flight. Wait, California is another 4 hours on top of that. Like, there's really some of this like dreaminess going on. But I think my tip related to it is really, you know your kids more than anyone, but I also think the listening to your kids' guts and what they're saying can be so important, because chances are every one of you has some college vision for your kids, but where you might be picturing them walking across the quad, arm in arm, under the beautiful trees, your kid might be thinking of being at the football game at a big, huge school, and the quad has nothing to do with anything. And kids will say things to me like, I would never go to that school because it was raining. I would never go to the school because the tour guide was fat. I mean, I have heard things that I'm like horrified, but we're dealing with teenagers and 17-year-olds. And if they get in their head that it rains at that school, of course it rains at that school. But if they're always going to have this sort of negative impression, or one parent used the example of, oh my God, the fire hydrant was painted pink. Okay, the parents like, it's the fire hydrant, right? Once the students decide I can't and don't want to go there, pushing them to want to go there, just sometimes you have to say, all right, we drove all this way here, but we're going to leave and it's going to be okay. Or we're going to go check out the town nearby and see what it's like to be in a college town, and use that information rather than about that school, but to say, okay, where's somewhere else that has this fun college town, even if this particular college isn't right.
So how do you then, okay, so my child wants a big school here, you know, and these are kind of the ones. How do you then know that they're the right match academically for that? You know, there's always this like, oh, that was their slam dunk and this is their reach. Like, yeah, how do you even know what that is?
So every college is going to publish some data about their school. A challenge right now is that while most people love that SATs are optional, that has also really skewed a data point that we used to have that gave some benchmark. But still, you can look at if a college calculates and publishes GPAs and SATs, that gives some idea. I also really hate to use acceptance rate as a proxy for like how to answer this question, but it is something that is a tangible thing. So for colleges, acceptance rate is 25%. Okay, 75% of the kids that apply don't get in. Is your student someone who is in the top of their class and might be one of those 25%ers? You know your kids. Are they in? We talked at the beginning about the most rigorous classes at this school. Do they get all or mostly A's? Are they kids who are involved in all these kinds of activities? Are they those kind of anti-Indian kids that I mentioned? They might look at a school that's admitting fewer than 25%. If not, then there are plenty of schools that are admitting 50%, 60%, 80%, even 40%. You know, so I said, I don't like it to be a proxy because some of that number just comes from how many students did they convince to apply to that school. And there were schools that have gotten a little gluttonous, I think, over like more applications so we can reject more and have a lower acceptance rate. But in general, schools with lower than a 25% acceptance rate are a reach for most students. Schools with lower than a 10% acceptance rate not only are a reach for most students, but even with that, it gets harder and harder and harder to guess or discern who might get in. But there's a lot of schools in that sort of 30 to 60 range where most students are going to have some shot. And within that, some, of course, will be stronger than others.
So now let's talk a second about determining if your child is not ready and or a four-year college is not the way to go.
Mhm.
How can we help guide them in that regard?
So sometimes that's also a question that has to wait longer than a parent might prefer it wait. A lot of parents, whether you're a natural planner or not, a lot of parents thinking about college have this plan in their head, right? So this is how it's going to go. You're going to go to kindergarten, then you're going to go to first grade, then blah, blah, blah. You're going to go to high school, and then you're going to go to college. And all of a sudden it's like, whoa, wait a minute. So I think it's another place about knowing your child. Do they seem not ready because actually they're really scared? And so the not readiness is more of just a reaction to that. Or are they not ready because the feedback you're getting from faculty or people at the school is that academically they're not feeling prepared, emotionally they don't seem prepared? Are you noticing that emotionally they don't seem prepared? I think it's two different questions. There are also some kids that very well could be ready, but really just need a break. High school has been really intense forever. It's gotten worse. And since the pandemic, of the kids with online learning and Zoom learning and not having a traditional high school experience these past few years, they're feeling it. I'm at a school that was open as much as anybody. Like we were closed in spring of 2020, but we were fully open last year. And still our kids, you say something about, oh, we'll have a Zoom meeting. And they're like, oh my God, don't make me, right? But that's been learning for this batch of teenagers. So there are kind of two ways to handle it. There's the idea of taking a break and applying to college a year later. When students want to do that, I still recommend that if they're ever going to take the SAT, they still take it while they're in high school, because just like we all don't remember exactly what we learned in geometry in 10th grade, even the kids, once they're a little bit more removed, they stop remembering, and this test is sort of normed for that age group, as I mentioned before. I recommend getting teacher recommendations while the teachers still know the students, so they don't have to think back and remembering, everything about them. In some cases, I even remember I even recommend filling out an application, even if the student doesn't send it, but so that if they have questions or think this might be a challenge, they have someone they can ask, even if they don't fully write an essay, but they kind of like wrap their heads around it. So if they applied the next year, the college would say, they'd come in as a freshman and or 2 years, whenever it is, and the college would just say, what have you been doing between high school and now? There's a question in it, right in the application for everyone, of if you had some space between high school and now, what have you been doing? There are other students who apply to college, get accepted to college, and then formally take what's called a gap year, where they might do an internship, they might travel, they might enroll in some sort of learning program. There's a program based out of Worcester called Dynamy that's kind of a life skills building program. Kids like live on their own in apartments and have internships, and they have to like get up and take the bus and some of those kinds of things. So there's programs all over this area, all over the country and all over the world, service-oriented, religiously oriented, that sometimes provides that break. And there are other students that taking just a few classes and not formally being enrolled is helpful. So maybe as a family, you agree that, okay, we're not going to do full college, but we're going to see which schools might have that opportunity to take just a few classes. Community college can be an excellent option for students in that category, both for the ability to take classes for full credit, but also to either live at home or live nearby if part of the life skills pieces in the picture, and kind of get used to college level learning and engagement. Some students then might finish after getting their associate's degree and be done with college. And others might find that that's a springboard to transferring to a 4-year school that they might be much more ready for a little bit later. But I guess the biggest thing in the whole question is my advice would be still as a senior to do some of the things that everyone else is doing. So even if they wait till they're 22, by the time they're 22, if they're going to go to college, then there might not be they might not ask for a teacher recommendation from high school, but they still actually might. Somebody just put in related to that in the chat of would that be guaranteed to be a transfer? Once you've started to earn college credits, you often change to being a transfer. And I say often because there's a little nuance in that. And it could be that maybe you take 2 or 3 classes and that's okay. But once you're kind of enrolled somewhere, you then, regardless of age, your status moves to being a transfer student because you're coming in with credit.
Is that good or bad? Or just
Either. Financially, it can be excellent. Socially, it can be more challenging because you might, age-wise, you might be in a different, like, you could be in a funky position of if you're an older freshman or a younger transfer or, whatever, but what you can't do is pretend you didn't do college. So you can't go to a community college for a year, like your grades, hate your grades, like your credits, hate your credits, and then say, okay, I'm going to do a do-over and apply to college as a freshman. You can't, the system doesn't do that. Once you've taken courses for credit, they count, at the next school.
Can we keep going? Because we've come
Sure.
to 9. Okay. There was a question in here. I have the same question. My mirror has anxiety, ADHD, so on and so forth, struggles, right? Like school is not easy, but that might mean that, college is right or not. What are their services and how does one find services and how do we articulate that in the application process?
Okay, so there's typically, there goes back to my it depends, but there's typically a few different options, and some will depend on some of the things around school culture and school resources. I'll start with the most minimum and move up from there. At the most minimum, by law, colleges have to provide what are determined reasonable accommodations for a student with any kind of disability, whether it's a learning difference or a physical disability or other kinds of things. Reasonable accommodations has some flexibility among the lawyers in how they determine what's reasonable, but it might be something like having a note taker so the student can focus differently while someone else takes the notes. It might be extended time on tests or on papers. There's like a whole laundry list of kinds of services a student might have. It is rare for a student to get any of those kinds of services if they have not had them in high school. To get them in high school, as most of you probably know if you have kids with learning differences, is you need either an IEP or some other diagnosed learning difference to get services in the high school that may lead to services in college. So every college that has any kind of federal funding, which is just about everywhere with maybe the exception of a few religious-y places, and even then most do, colleges are going to offer that reasonable accommodation. Then there's a step up that there are colleges that offer learning centers or academic support, academic resource centers, whatever they're called. Sometimes there's a fee for them, sometimes not, but that we're a student working with that learning center, it's not just going to be the accommodation of, okay, you have extended time. They're going to have access to someone to help them learn on work on their executive functioning skills or work on their anxiety, whether through psychological counseling or just additional academic support, right? Tutoring, more one-on-one help and support. And many colleges offer that, but not all. That's a step above the reasonable accommodation. Then another step up is there are colleges that have full programs for students to enroll in as a supplemental piece to doing college, where they're also going to have regular ongoing learning support. So it's not just drop into a tutoring center once in a while or make an appointment when you need it. It's more like as part of their college experience, they're going to also have specific classes and resources as part of a learning program. So the PAL program at Curry College locally in Milton, Mass is very well known for that. On a very different scale, large, far away, University of Arizona has a program called SALT. It's a similar thing. There are programs like that. And then there are some schools that are specifically for students with learning needs and learning accommodations, that everyone in the school is taking advantage of those resources. So there's Landmark College in Vermont is more local, Beacon College in Florida, and there's a few others. Those are probably the two most well-known. So there's a whole range of what a student might need, but the most important thing is if you think your student might need some support in college, to make sure they're not only have access to the resources in high school, but they're utilizing them. If the student could have extra time, but then says, yeah, I don't use it, I don't need it, that could be a problem later. Like either they need it and should use it, or they don't, but some of the questions they might get later can affect the services they'll get in college. So Jennessa asked the question, and then it's also in the chat about sharing a disability with a college. And there isn't an easy answer for every student, but there is often an easy answer for a family. There are families that have said to me, I don't want the college to know anything. Okay, so what can happen then is that can be fine, or it can be that the college doesn't know anything and then the student gets there and needs some help and support, and the college is like, we didn't know you needed anything. What are you talking about? So that can play out both ways. Legally, students are not required and cannot be required to disclose anything. I never or hardly ever recommend that a student would disclose anything like through an essay, because you get one shot in an essay to write something that's important to you. And when you choose that that's the main focus, all of a sudden it kind of often defines students in a way. But there are other places that in the applications that a student might share it. So if a student like really loves basketball, would like to write about basketball, and instead writes this essay about, oh, I work with my learning center teacher once a week, or, oh, I have anxiety, but I'm proud of how I handled this situation. Those could be really important moments for the students, but it's not sending a message to the college about here's who I am and why I'm going to be an exciting part of this community. With a basketball story, we might see some passion and excitement and enthusiasm from the student, or learn a little bit about, a talent that they have if they play, or, whatever, something like that. So if a college has some of the services, like if a student is applying to a program that specifically has, like I just mentioned, if a student's applying to a program to get learning services, they will have to send documentation either as part of the college application process or right after. There are some programs like Westfield State has one where they interview every student to learn more about what they need before they make their admission decisions if you're going to go into this learning program. So then you share all the documentation. So it really varies, but I've had students who can't wait to tell the college, look at how I've grown. I have this learning difference, but I feel so successful now because all of these skills and tools I've learned. Now this who say to me, oh, I didn't even know you knew that I worked with the Learning Center. Like, I'm certainly not telling a college. So that's again, a kind of a gut decision at times. A college cannot say, we're rejecting you because you have a learning difference. Like, that comes back to the reasonable accommodation part. But once it's out there, it's also out there that the college has to look realistically and say, if this is what a student is saying, does this feel reasonable? If it feels reasonable, fine. If it feels like the student is going to be a challenge, and that could come out in many, many, many ways, not just about disclosing a learning difference, then they might look at the application a little bit differently.
Last set of questions that I think we've gotten this, and I think all the things that I said we were going to talk about, but as we do this question, if anything else that you have a burning desire to know, and we haven't addressed it, put it in, or we can have.
We could have spent it.
Mute. What?
I also feel like some of my questions, I've gotten a little long-winded in the answers, but sometimes we have full programs, like a whole evening program.
I'm serious. I could listen to you talk all night. Like, I really I don't know if others are, this is all fascinating to me. All right. How in the heck am I going to pay for college? Like, what, that's a big piece of selecting a school, like knowing what is doable for our family. Like, that, I feel like that I know is probably an hours long.
Right. It is. And actually, I'm putting in the chat an organization called MIFA, which is a funny little name. It's the Massachusetts Educational Financing Authority. They do excellent workshops, webinars for parents and students. Most are more parent focused. And those do start with working with younger kids. And that might be something to do, as adults, to learn a little bit more about the financing process. They probably still have some this spring. They tend to run them in September, October, when seniors, families are really focusing on this. And then again in like March, April, as seniors are getting admissions decisions. And even though we're talking about younger kids, that's the time of year where MIFA's like events are kind of highlighted. But they have an events button. If you go to that website, you'll see it pretty easily. So that's if you want the hour-long answer. A shorter answer and a quicker thing, though, without sitting through the hour, is that every college by law is required to have something called a net price calculator. And they're not perfect, but that's a way to say, okay, this college, here's kind of the sticker price. You hear, oh my God, this college costs $70,000. How am I ever going to afford that? Well, you can put in some information about your family that will help calculate what might be within a general idea of what your family might pay. So maybe it's a college that gives preferential packaging, it's called, to students that have done really well in high school. They might get a little bump through merit scholarships or how the school packages. So, oh, my student gets mostly A's, that 70,000 just dropped to 55. I'm making up numbers, right? Oh, I own a house, that number is going to go up. Oh, I have my own college debt I'm still paying out, that number is going to go down. So it asks a series of general financial aid type questions and will give you some idea. What the system, a reason it's imperfect, what the system doesn't know is it doesn't know every detail, and it doesn't know what else is going to come through in the application. The student could have all A's, but then you found out that, oh, they actually blew up a car and, you know, had a 2-week suspension, probably would be even longer. Yeah, maybe we're not going to give merit money to that kid after all, and maybe we're not even going to admit them if they blew up that car. You know, that was an extreme example, but they don't know the whole story. Some colleges also are much more transparent in revealing than others. But I would say pick a college, go into the financial aid section and try it. You could maybe pick a public school like Salem State or UMass, or an out-of-state public, University of Wisconsin, it doesn't matter where, University of Iowa. And then you could pick a private school, look at BU, which happens to be the most expensive in the country. But eventually the government will calculate through the FAFSA, the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, you'll learn what your EFC is. Your EFC stands for Estimated Family Contribution. If your EFC, let's say, is 20,000, your family can afford around 20,000. If the school costs 20, you're going to pay full price. If the school costs 60, you're still going to pay around 20. And that's where financial aid is going to make up the difference. The difference could be grant or scholarship money that you and your kids don't pay back. It could be loans. Hopefully it's not that deep a loan that for students or parents to pay back after. There could be a work study component where the kids are expected to have a job on campus. Like there's all different packaging. It also could be that your EFC is 20 and the college decides, well, maybe we can get 23 out of you. Or your EFC is 20 and the school says, we would really love to have your kid here. You're only going to pay 10. So that becomes like a piece of it later to think through. But I would start with, if you're really into being curious about financial aid, I would look at that MIFA site, both for resources and for their information sessions. MIFA is sort of a public-private partnership. They have an arm that does student loans and things like that. I actually really know nothing or very little about that business side of what they do, but they also have funding to be an educational like authority and resource around financial aid, specifically for people in Massachusetts. So if you happen to be on this call and you're outside of Massachusetts, you could still certainly watch the webinar and learn things, but some of the things they share will be locally focused.
And when you talk about like grants and scholarships, is there a place to see all of those monies available? And is there, one of the questions was like, is there like too many, too few, and so forth to have your child apply for?
So it's sort of a yes and no. The most success I see with scholarships, well, let me back up for a second. There are colleges that have set aside a pool of money for what they call merit scholarships. This is separate from what does your family need. This is what are we going to do to entice your student to come to our school based on a talent that they have, on grades that they got, on a part of the country that they're from, because we don't have enough kids from Iowa, whatever it is, all of that lumps into merit even if it's the meritoriousness of being born in Iowa, right? It's often North Dakota more than Iowa. But so that each college will say, oh, we offer this many scholarships or this percentage, or this is a typical package or things like that. But that's harder to like get a list of who does that and how much. And it also varies a lot. For what are called outside scholarships, this is where what I was going to start to say, most students do the best with actually small scholarships that are related to someone or something that they have a specific connection to. In other words, some of you as parents or your partners or spouses may work for a company that the company has some scholarship money available, especially if it's a corporate. Some of you may belong to a church or synagogue where they give a scholarship. Some of your kids might be in a youth group. There's a scholarship, but the kids might work at a supermarket like Shaw's. I don't know if they still do this. When I was in high school, I had friends that worked for Shaw's and they applied for these scholarships then. The hard part is that's, oh, great, I got $500 and the bill is still $60,000. I got $200 and the bill's down to $59,500. But those are the scholarships where students have the most success. There is a website that's actually pretty good called FastWeb. That is what you're asking about, sort of a search engine. And those you can put in things like, it's kind of the more specific, the better. Oh, I'm a twin. Well, that's going to be a lot smaller percentage of the population than, oh, I'm female, whatever. FastWeb is a search that you can put in all kinds of things. I have found that the fewer things this scholarship asks for, the harder it is to get. Oh, all I have to be is a female from the United States. Oh my God, half the population's eligible. But if I have to be a female twin who speaks Spanish, that's going to like narrow it down more and more and more. So the how many versus how few, some of it is really about the time and effort because it often does require an essay or extra work. And if it doesn't, it's harder and harder to get. But it's also on the worth it scale, some of these like, oh, national search scholarships on the worth it scale don't often become worth it for the 500 or $1,000 you're going to get. But the local things that I mentioned before, oh, one other thing is that a lot of high schools or town halls, city halls have scholarship book resources for kids in your own community. So at the high school I went to Brockton High. Well, I had over 1,000 kids in my class, but we all got this booklet at the time saying, here's all these scholarships for kids from Brockton. And I know now I'm at a private school, but I have kids from many communities. The town of Needham every year says we have this scholarship for kids from Needham. If you have any kids from Needham this year, please share the information. The Sharon Lions Club in Sharon, Massachusetts, same thing. If you have any kids from Sharon, please have them, and they do service and community service work, please have them consider our scholarship. So those are again local and small, but you might check with either your school or like city hall or town hall, like your mayor's office, somebody like that to ask.
Awesome. I have one last question that's out of order.
Okay.
I forgot to ask it. And then anything else, put it in the chat. Okay. This whole concept, they've applied to the schools and now they start getting the acceptance, right? Early decision, like what is all of, how, I don't understand how that works and how, what is one versus the other.
Okay, I'll start with that part, the definitions, and weave that into how it works. There are probably about 5 or 6 different kinds of application plans. So it does get kind of confusing. Thank you, Sarah. The most common phrases you will hear are early decision, early action, and regular decision. But there's also rolling and priority and a few others, so I'll touch on those too. Early decision is what the term is, a binding agreement where you meaning the student, hopefully not you filling it out, bad idea. The student applies to a school, and if they're admitted, they're going. So the agreement is you take me, I come. Yes, it's contingent on financial aid, but there's also an expectation that families are going to fill out their paperwork and, make things work. And if the package isn't going to work, there's a process for that. But in general, if you take me, I'm coming. You're my first choice school. You're my dream school. I'm yours. That deadline most commonly is November 1st, but it could be as late as December 1st, November 15th, whatever. Usually students apply, they hear about 6 weeks later. So if they're in, they're done. If they're not in, it's still before the regular decision deadlines, which tend to come in January, mid-January, early February. So there's still time to turn around and file other applications. Early action has a similar time frame that students typically apply around November 1st, but those schools are saying, I wish that was actually called early answer or something, because early action is find out early, but you're not making any commitment to us. We're just going to let, if you can get the stuff to us early, we'll let you know early. Early action is really a business decision. Well, they all are, but it's a business decision on behalf of the schools, because they can get their work done over the span of November through March instead of having everything come in at once. So they say, yeah, we'll let a group of kids come early. Some of those students will choose to attend, some won't. Some will say yes right away when they hear in December, but they'll have until May to decide. Regular decision is typically due January 1st, maybe January 15th or February 1st, and students hear by the end of March. The national date that all colleges agree to, that the deposit and the final decision is due, is May 1st. So that's the timeline. So students hear in March and decide in May. With early action, they might hear in December or January, but they still can decide in May. But early decision, if students get in, they usually have like a week or 2 weeks to like send in their deposit and commit and wrap up. So there are some other kinds of timelines. Like I mentioned, there's rolling admission, which means that depending on the school, 2 to 6 weeks after the application is complete, they'll give an answer. So a student applies by Thanksgiving, they know by Christmas. They apply around Christmas, they know in the middle of January, and they kind of like roll out the answers over time. That has a lot more flexibility, but some of those schools start to fill up because they've admitted kids in the fall, and they start taking away slots, but usually there's some more flexibility of when to do it. Some of the most competitive schools in the country have something called restricted early action or restrictive. I hear both terms. That's like usually early action, you can do it several places. When it's restricted, they're telling you can only pick one. So Yale's an example of a school that has that you can apply to this one school, REA it's called, and you can't apply to others, but you still don't have to commit. So if you get in, you can still apply to other schools if you want to, although most of the students that get into Yale go to Yale. So anyways, there's a few others with a little more flexibility. Most applications, there's a common application that you may have heard of, or maybe depending on your age even used, that is common information that goes to every college. Some colleges have their own application instead, and some colleges have some of their own questions. The questions used to be called supplements. The Common App doesn't use the term anymore, but all the kids do. But there are these like questions specific to the college. So every college would get, here's my name and address, my activities, my essay. This college wants me to write a different essay on why I want to go to Lehigh. And this college wants me to answer a question based on a famous quote from someone who graduated from whatever, pick your favorite school. There's like some nuance. But once the main application is done, it's going to be the same whether you apply early decision, early action, regular decision. So a lot of the timing is about getting stuff done. There can be some advantages to applying early, but sometimes I hear that it's this huge advantage to apply early, and sometimes that's true. But for some students, waiting till they have more senior grades or they have more of other things senior year underway, maybe additional testing, maybe just showing strength in an area that has been a challenge. There's different reasons why sometimes waiting is better. It's also better to wait if a student just needs a little more time in their essay. It's often better to wait because any advantage you might have had in applying a little earlier goes away if you're not sending in your best work. Like it goes away quickly.
That was so good. And I'm going to assume that I asked all the right questions and you all have all the answers you were looking for. As I said, this is recorded, you guys, and I know that I'm going to have to go back and listen, but I will. I've saved the chat, and I will, when I send the replay, we'll send, just as a reminder, all of the websites that she noted.
I saw one more in the chat that I wish I had noted at the time, that I just want to go all the way back to when we were talking about test optional. Somebody asked in the chat if test optional really means optional. And that is a yes. In fact, there's a little like kind of an electronic sticker that colleges can have that says at my school optional means optional, that, you know, I sometimes see on their websites. If a school is test optional, when I mentioned that they'll look at essays and activities and recommendations and maybe an interview and all these different kinds of things, if testing should be part of that pie, the testing piece just goes away and everything else just counts for a little bit more. The only times that test optional does not mean yes, really optional, is when there's a but. Well, we're optional, but we really prefer that you take it. Or it's optional, but it's recommended. Well, then it's not quite as optional. But if a school just says test optional and there's no but or and, then yes, optional means optional. And so many of my colleagues, I've been on so many webinars, my coworker calls me the webinar queen, but on this topic of test optional admissions, because it's so overwhelming and confusing and all consuming, as every year for the past 3 years, we've had different answers. So many of my colleagues that thought, how are we ever going to make decisions without tests, are saying, I never want to go back to having testing. So I really think that that landscape is changing significantly. Sherri just put in the chat, some schools are saying by major, you may have to opt in. And yes, there's some nuance, although even for nurses, like majors like nursing, that traditionally was a very test focused major. There are many schools that are now also test optional for nursing and keeping it that way. So we'll see, again, depending on the age. If you have a junior, I think it's unlikely, now that we're into May, that schools' policies are going to change for the fall. I mean, like I said, University of Tennessee just did 2 weeks ago, but I think they're really an outlier. If you have a sophomore or younger, you got to ask me a year from now. You got to like just look at the college website. There's a site called Fair Test, which is it's the National Center for Fair and Open Testing. They are a think tank on high stakes testing, not just for colleges, but for grad programs and for different kinds of, a little bit of industry too, but mostly education. They are the keepers of the list. They have a section on their website, and it's really just a list. It's not at all a fancy website. But if you look in Fair Test at the university optional list, you can find all of the schools' test optional testing. If they're test optional, you can find all of the schools on the list on that site. And they are like nationally known. They are the place. If a school decides to change their policy, the first thing they do is tell Fair Test, and then they tell the rest of the world. They're like, some of these things are like, oh, it depends. Fair Test is a definite, specific, and very reliable resource.
Awesome. And
they happen to be based in Cambridge, which is kind of cool. Like they're a local thing, but they're a national organization.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. I knew this was more than an hour, and I thank you for being willing to stay. And
yes, and thank you for those of you that hung in for the extra half hour.
I know, you're like troopers. So thank you, thank you.
You're welcome.
I will. Thanks for all that came. Thank you so much, Sherri. And,
you're welcome.
We'll talk later.
Okay, and if there are any, like some of the things I kind of rattled off, if there are some things you want me to let you know what I was talking about that you're going to share with the group, let me know.
Awesome.
Okay.
Great.
All right. Good night,
Thank
everybody.
you. Bye.
Bye.